Politics Live now on BBC Two.
It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster.
The world has changed because we face a new era of threats. We need a new era for defence in order to keep Britain more secure and safer.
A big increase in defence spending by 2027, but will it impress Donald Trump as Keir Starmer heads to the White House? But before that, it's Prime Minister's questions, and not all Labour MPs are happy with cuts to the aid budget.
It's the wrong decision. It's going to impact not just on the poorest people in the world, but also on us here. This does not make us safer.
Kemi Badenoch takes on Keir Starmer at noon. We will bring you that live. Also on the programme today.
What we are laying out today is a massive industrial revolution.
The government is told that by 2040, half of households will have to have one of these instead of a gas boiler. And most cars will have to be electric to meet our carbon emissions targets. But are the British public on side? And it's rubbish, but why do some people not give a toss about littering? Joining us today, the Labour MP Peter Swallow, Conservative MP Harriet Baldwin, Times columnist Matthew Syed, and non-affiliated peer Saeed Owasi. This is Politics Live. Hello and welcome to the programme. Let us start with some advice that has been given to ministers this morning. Let's have a look at this headline on the BBC News website. Half of homes need a heat pump by 2040, the government is told. This is a report from the Climate Change Committee. It provides independent advice to ministers about reaching net zero by 2050. It provides advice in 5-year chunks known as carbon budget, so the route to get to net zero by 2050. Now, this advice is not, it's not policy, but historically the government does accept it, and if it does become legally binding. Peter, can I start with you? I mean, are the public on board with this?
Yeah, look, the public know that we have to get serious on tackling the challenges in our energy system. We have to go further and faster to make sure we've got a fair transition to net zero, and that will mean cheaper bills for people. It will mean that they're able to pay those bills much more reliably. It will also mean that we're much less dependent on foreign oil and gas. We'll get Putin's foot off of our neck, and we'll have domestic produced power that we can rely on. It's about making sure that we're producing more here at home.
Right, I mean, but the pace of change of behaviour is quite astonishing in terms of what the committee is recommending. Half of homes needing a heat pump by 2040. I mean, that's a huge, huge change in behaviour. Are the public really ready? Do they want this?
But the technology is developing, and as people's boilers come to the end of their natural lives, that they will be looking at what's best in order to replace those boilers. The government's got some really helpful incentives out there, £7,500 available to households to make that transition to a heat pump. But we're not talking about sort of a revolution overnight. This is a long-term strategy to get us to where we need to be as a country.
Harriet, do people want this?
I think we've got to be very pragmatic about it, because I do think that's got to be the direction of travel. But I'm also concerned about some of the decisions in terms of electricity prices, and also to do with our own natural resources, our own oil and gas. And I would prefer that rather than having to import from other countries, that we focus on our own supplies first.
Harriet, that's exactly what we've got to do. And that's why under 14 years of previous government not taking the decisions needed to make sure that we're producing more energy here in the UK, we've got in this mess where we're over-reliant on oil and gas prices on the international market.
Well, you're dealing with the situation with the Rosebank field, and I personally would like to rely on our own supplies of natural gas rather than importing as much as we do. And I'd also like to hear when the £300 less that people were told in the Labour manifesto is going to come through, because at the moment we heard yesterday we're all going to pay more for our electricity. It's key that people also get a price signal signal to make this switch, and at the moment the price signal is exactly the wrong way. So it's going to be tough, I think, to bring people with us, and we don't want to go forcing people to do things they don't want to do in a way that generates a backlash.
Right, so we need to kind of hold off potentially and slow the pace down in adoption until the price is right.
I'd like to see a lot faster and more of the nuclear programme and the small modular reactors, and I'd like to see us exploit our own natural gas and our own carbon here, rather than relying as much as we do on imports.
Matthew.
Well, I think we missed a trick when it comes to energy by not building a bigger fleet of nuclear power stations 30, 40 years ago. We would have got on a learning curve. South Korea is currently building nuclear power stations that is providing cheap, clean electricity at about a quarter of the price that we're able to deliver it. China's building out 22 nuclear power stations with a time of 6 years from shovel in the ground to completion. Whatever we decide to do, we in this country have to become better at building. We're probably the worst in the world at this. The planning for the Thames Tunnel, I think, ran to 400,000 pages and cost 300 million. The planning alone. Norway built the world's longest road tunnel, actually built the tunnel, the thing itself, for I think half that price. We need for energy, we need infrastructure, we need pylons, we need chargers for cars. And unless we can deal with this deep endemic dysfunction in our capacity to build, and this fish disco, have you heard this?
We are going to.
I mean, this is ridiculous. It shows me that we're an unserious country. We can have these theological discussions about what we should do, but unless we're capable of actually implementing and delivering infrastructure effectively, all of it will blow our budgets.
Right. Well, you mentioned the fish disco. Let us talk about that. Seeing as you have brought that up, let's have a look at the headline today in the Financial Times. This is very much about environmental objectives running up against the imperative for growth. We have, I think, the headline in today's Financial Times talking about EDF, which is building the Hinkley Point C nuclear reactor. The headline saying fish disco row risks fresh delays to Hinkley Point nuclear plant. So EDF had committed to building what's described as an acoustic fish deterrent. This is underwater loudspeakers blasting out noise every day for 60 years to deter fish in the Bristol Channel, basically to stop them being sucked into underwater cooling systems. It's now in a bit of a row, EDF, with the Environment Agency over this because the Environmental Agency says it has to build it, and now environmental groups are saying they need to stick to their plans, delay potentially to this huge infrastructure project. I mean, Saida, do you think this is exactly the problem that the government is trying to solve, to stop these sorts of things, bat tunnels, fish protection systems getting in the way of big infrastructure growth and clean energy?
I think we're fiddling around on the edges. I think, first of all, we need to start by having a really serious conversation in this country about the kind of world we want to live in. And I think what is important from what the government has published is to say, look, stage by stage, we need to start to implement behavioural change. And that includes everything from consuming less meat, looking at the way in which fast fashion is dealt with in this country, looking at the way in which energy is supplied, the cars that we drive, the fuel that we have. All of these conversations need to be had. We are in a serious situation where, as my kids keep saying to us, our generation have overconsumed, effectively gobbled up the earth, and now we need to put ourselves in a position where we create a more sustainable world alongside a sustainable economy which allows the next generations to enjoy the benefits that we enjoyed. And that means the government has to find the right balance between climate change and growth. And the two aren't in conflict because the two can actually work together. But that does require government to be brave enough to say, this is the problem, this is the solution, this is how we need to get there, and this is what we need you as the public to get behind.
Right, Peter, I mean, are you prepared to be brave enough? If you look at some of the things that the committee is recommending, I mean, it's across the board. We're talking about flights, we're talking about reduction in sheep and cattle numbers. It's everywhere. It's a widespread change in every walk of life. Are you brave enough to tell people this is what they need to do to meet this target? Well,
look, on those specific recommendations, the government will obviously have to look at them really carefully and take each one as it comes. But on the broad point Baroness Varzi makes, I think is absolutely right. We've got we've fallen into the trap in this country for too long of pretending that investing in green infrastructure, tackling climate change and protecting nature and supporting growth are all pulling in different directions. And actually they're not. Investing in green infrastructure, making sure we've got domestic energy production where we need it, is good for the economy, it's good for growth, it's good for jobs, and it's good for the planet. It's a win-win.
Well, you're saying that growth and the environment are too compatible. I mean, one of the key areas is the expansion of airports, isn't it, where these two imperatives are running up against each other. We've heard from the Transport Secretary, Heidi Alexander, last night speaking to the airline industry. Let's have a look very briefly at this BBC News headline. Again, Minister backs expansion of airports as Gatwick decisions looms. We know that Rachel Reeves is very much in favour of Heathrow, an additional runway there. Heidi Alexander, the Transport Secretary, is about to decide on whether Gatwick can expand its capacity, putting into full use its standby runway. I mean, there's a lot of faith going on, isn't there, in sustainable air fuel, in electric planes. I mean, we're not there yet. I mean, the committee is clear that demand for air travel needs to fall as a major component of getting to 2050. It's just not compatible.
Airport expansion is really important for growth. It delivers jobs.
But air travel needs to come down if we're going to get anywhere near net zero.
And
sustainable fuel, it doesn't seem to be the answer at the moment.
We have to look at all decisions as part of an overall package. So I've been really clear that any expansion for Heathrow or Gatwick needs to come with better investment in transport infrastructure to support those expansions, to get more cars off the road. That can be a positive thing for the environment. We need better links to the rest of the world. We also need better links within the UK. And the only way to get that infrastructure that we need is to get the growth we need to support it.
Harriet.
It goes back to the point about comparisons internationally as well. I think we do have an important role to show in leadership. We were the first parliament in the world to put in place net zero, and a majority of the world's parliaments now have done that. I think it's an important role we have to play. But at the same time, if we go too far and too fast and we make things so expensive, like the price of energy in this country, that the production just moves somewhere else, then it's not helping the whole planet. So there's a balance to be struck, and we've got to look very carefully at what's being recommended here.
Right. I mean, I just do want to draw attention to something you mentioned earlier about bills going up. I mean, Peter, we were promised by Labour £300 off energy bills by 2030, bills coming down under a Labour government. But if we look at this headline in The Guardian, average annual energy bill to rise to £1,849 in Great Britain from April. This is because Ofgem, the regulator, has increased its cap. That is the average household bill, expected a £111 rise from April. Peter, why are bills going up?
So that's based on foreign energy markets, which is exactly why it's so important that we become far less reliant on importing foreign energy. We have to make more here in the UK.
Right, but it's a long way off, isn't it, that target of bringing energy bills down? Meanwhile, bills are going up and up and up each year.
No, this government is moving at a rapid pace to make sure that we're producing more here. So we've approved more solar than under the last 14 years of Conservative government, just in the first 7 months of a Labour government. That is the difference that a Labour government is making. We're investing in Britain, we're investing in Great British Energy, and that ultimately will be the path to bringing people's bills down.
And one of the reasons why energy is so expensive is our complete failure to build.
Yeah.
That's the explanation. And part of that, only part of it, are these ridiculous constraints based on bat tunnels, inordinately expensive bat tunnels, and the fish discos. That is, as I mentioned a bit earlier, unserious. And let's just remember where we're at. We must grow the economy because there is war in Europe. It's not impossible that the Baltics will be invaded. Poland feels under pressure. We have completely failed to spend on defence. If we want to get to net zero, we need to avoid world war. We're not a very long distance away from that. If Taiwan is invaded, there's war in the Middle East. That would be war simultaneously in 3 theatres, not dissimilar to the pattern in World War II. Unless we're willing to recognise that we need to grow to fund the defence that saves the free world, which is the precondition for any attempt to get to net zero, we're going to get nowhere. And these special interest groups that are prioritising relatively small amounts of fish over our ability to, you're right, we need energy. Energy is a central ingredient of economic growth. I find it completely intolerable, the superficiality of our debate at the moment.
And in an increasingly unstable world, energy security is national security. It's the patriotic thing to do to invest in Great British energy and to build more here.
To go back to Matthew's point about the importance of nuclear, I mean, he is making a really, really important point, because there are going to be many times when there is no sun in this country. We've experienced a few months of that recently, and there are days when there is no wind, and those are the days when you're going to need that nuclear baseload. And the reason that gas prices have spiked, and it's a global price, and this would happen even if we've installed a lot more solar and a lot more wind, is because the marginal cost of energy is the gas price, and we need to install more nuclear to avoid that. Such a big impact.
One slightly positive point. It's been a bit gloomy, hasn't it? So but you know, there's obviously an incredible amount of energy in fission technology, splitting. But you know what the game changer will be? And we might not be far off, optimistically. We've been saying this for a long time, but it's nuclear fusion. That would provide almost limitless, cheap energy. And that would transform, in a way that's almost unimaginable, our world. The only issue that worries me a bit about nuclear fusion is, with that amount of energetic and thermodynamic power, are we wise enough to be able to channel it well?
OK. Right, I do want to turn to another environmental issue now. It's something, Saida, that you are passionate about in your work alongside Clean Up Britain. We will hear about your work in a minute. But first, let us talk to Tirza Mayenema, co-founder of the Anti-Litter Society. We are talking about littering. Tirza, many thanks for joining us here on Politics Live. Can you just tell us how bad the problem is in your area?
It's bad. I wouldn't say, because we are Slough based, I wouldn't say we're one of the worst ones, but I think compared to other areas in UK, we are bad. There's a lot of litter around us. Right,
and how did you get a band of you together to try to combat it, going on litter picks and trying to remove some of the rubbish from the natural environment?
Yeah, so we met. I was actually just walking at the back end of COVID. I was walking in a park, and I met someone and she was litter picking. So I said to her, "Amazing work, what you're doing here." And then we just met up together and we started this litter picking society. And then month by month, we're growing, and we're almost doing this 4 years now.
Right. I mean, and how do you feel about having to do this? I mean, you know, it's obviously an incredible community effort and it makes a difference to everybody. But I mean, do you feel annoyed that it's been left up to you to have to do this in the first place?
Yeah. So it's a combination of thoughts in my head, to be honest. Of course, indeed. It's annoyance, because people should be cleaning up after themselves. Like, why are we cleaning up litter that other people are leaving behind? But at the other end is also a great way to create a community and bring people together. We organize a lot of themed litter picks, like Halloween litter pick or Easter litter pick, pub crawl litter pick, etc. So we bring people together around that theme of litter picking and being more aware of the environment.
OK, Tirza, thanks so much. Stay with us briefly. I mean, Saida, you're working in this area, teaming up with the campaign group Clean Up Britain. Clearly, groups like Tirza's are sort of solving the problem as they see it, but obviously, ideally, is to go back to source. What do you think? What are you proposing to help keep Britain tidier?
I mean, there are amazing people like Tirza and groups like hers up and down this country who litter pick. I litter pick every week, have been doing it for decades. But all we are doing is effectively trying to mop up whilst the tap's still on. And I think our campaign now in Clean Up Britain, and where I've got to, is to say this has got to stop. We cannot go out week after week after week, hundreds of people across this country, to try and clean up other people's litter. And it's not just litter, it's fly tipping. We are one of the dirtiest nations in the Western world. We have a fifth of our councils simply do not take any action on fly tipping and littering. And as a Conservative, instinctively, I always say, let's not legislate. Let's try and implement culture, behaviour change. But we've got to a point where to create a sense of pride and belonging in our nation, where people feel like the places in which they live are nice places to live, it has to start by having clean streets. And, you know, Taser talks about Slough. You go to countryside lanes, you go to beaches, you go to motorway, you know, you go to cities, across this country, unfortunately, we are sinking under this. And every time I talk about this, my inbox is heaving. This is something that bothers Britain and Brits. And we have to start with a national campaign, starting with schools, through our educational institutions, across the public, to say this is unacceptable. The implications of this for our climate, for wildlife, for our countryside, for people's basic mental health are so bad that actually we need to take this seriously.
I mean, Peter, Selena's right, isn't she, that this is something that people care about massively?
Yes.
But yet councils seem to have given up on the problem in many cases.
Well, I'm really pleased that Bracknell Forest Council, my local authority, have not done that. They're putting in CCTV at every neighbourhood recycling point. They issued 17 fines just over the Christmas period for fly tipping. But it is a massive issue, and look, we have to get to grips with it. I was really pleased to see the government bring in the deposit return scheme, which is going to provide incentives for people to do much more to recycle their waste. Bizarrely, that was something that the Conservatives voted against. I'm not entirely sure why. We're also going to be bringing in clean-up gangs to make sure that those who are caught fly tipping and littering are forced to get involved in cleaning up their waste. This government is going to be tough on litter and tough on the causes of litter.
I mean, Harriet, is this something that's got worse under your watch? We had an ONS report out today on fly tipping between 2023 and 24, found a 6% increase in fly tipping incidents, up to 1.15 million across England in that last year.
Well, can I first shout out to my litter picking groups as well? So whether it's Clifton Upon Team or Eastham, they have amazing groups. They call them wombling groups, and the district councils support them by providing them with the equipment and help, and also the what 3 words. So come and collect the litter we've put in the lay-by here. So there is a great deal of support, as you say, at local level for this. I totally agree that fly tipping is totally unacceptable. We increase the fines that district councils can levy on fly tippers, but I think CCTV plays a role as well in terms of catching people doing that. It is totally, totally unacceptable. And I endorse some of the technological advances that you see around the world, where you can actually trace back to the person who has dropped the McDonald's, for example, so who purchased the McDonald's in the first place. And there are some countries where they actually follow that back to source.
Harriet, how did you vote on the deposit return scheme?
I abstained.
And why did you do that?
Because I've advocated for a deposit return scheme for all the manifestos I've stood on. So I think it was something that seemed to me perhaps the timing was not ideal, but the direction of travel is a good one.
Right. I mean, Matthew, how do we change behaviour?
I think this is a very significant story and a symptom of a much bigger social phenomenon. Perhaps the most important emotion or psychological attribute to make a society work well is social stigma and a sense of shame. If you think about the miracle of queuing in this country, the choreography of it, it's balletic when you watch people through glances and nods, that they're able to spontaneously form social order when it might easily break down with the strongest going first. That is a remarkable phenomenon that we see in this country and across most civilizations. But it is held in place by a sense of shame. I once tried, just for my own personal interest, to see how people would react if I pushed in at my queue in M&S. And I moved closer and closer, and I saw people looking, thinking, is this person going to... And I couldn't, even just for the purposes of an experiment, I couldn't bring myself to do it. This littering, one of the reasons it's happening is the stigma associated with it has declined. Shoplifting, stigma associated with it has declined. Welfare fraud, it's declined. The thing that really gets me even more than littering, I agree it's significant, is people playing videos in trains without headphones.
Okay, so
it's blaring out. Have you not noticed? It's incredible to me. And that you have 4 or 5 people and they're just not bothered. And people aren't... So, yes, of course, it's to do with education. But we've got to be able to make people feel ashamed of what they're doing. And I don't know how easy it is to confront people who are littering and saying, you shouldn't be doing that.
I mean, Tirza, can I bring you back in for a moment? Because I think you do some work in schools, don't you, to try to educate young people on littering and how durable some of the things that they're tossing away are.
Yes, we do. We bring in, as we call it, vintage litter that we have found. So we have Chris bag, which is 2014, for example, still looks very good, even though it's 10 years been in the ground. So you can very easily show this to children and explain to them. This plastic doesn't just go away. It's 10 years that it's been in the ground. This one, 1992, is already looking a lot worse for wear, but it's in a very visible way to explain to children that it takes 80 years for a crisp packet to decompose into like microplastics. Yeah.
Right, and so are you seeing an impact when you go into classrooms? Do children have a bit of a light bulb moment that all the kind of snacks they're consuming are ending up in forests and parks?
Yes, I think children are very educated and they know a lot. They're very enthusiastic. After a presentation, they want to go out and they want to go litter picking. So at that age, they're enthusiastic and they want to get involved. I think in that like later ages, maybe later teenagers, then it becomes more difficult, and then it's not cool anymore to litter pick, or it is considered to be cool to drop everything that you leave. So yeah.
Okay.
That makes it.
Tirza, many thanks. Tirza Manima there, co-founder of the Slough Anti-Litter Society. Now, if you want to listen to politics live as well as watch it, you can find it on the live news stream on BBC Sounds. You can go to the live dial at the top of the BBC Sounds homepage and tap on live news. You can find BBC Sounds at bbc.co.uk/sounds or download the BBC Sounds app. Now, let us take a look at this recent headline from earlier in the month from The Telegraph. It says, Angela Rayner to set rules on Islam and free speech. It's saying that she is setting up an advisory council to come up with a definition of Islamophobia. The Telegraph is reporting that it's going to be headed up by the former Tory MP Dominic Grieve. But this is about government efforts to come up with an official definition of Islamophobia. Saida, do we need one?
Yes, we do. And it's not unusual because we have in government at the moment a definition, for example, to deal with other forms of racism like anti-Semitism. And what's important, I think, for us to say is that this definition, the Islamophobia definition, like the IHRA definition on anti-Semitism, is a non-legally binding working definition. Those words are important. What that means is this is not about prosecuting people. This is actually about judging institutions by behaviours within those institutions and trying to implement culture change. It's also a working definition like the IHRA anti-Semitism definition, which basically means it will continue to change as society continues to change. The APPG definition of Islamophobia, of which I was involved with.
That's the All-Party Parliamentary Group.
All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims, the definition that I was involved with and Dominic Grieve was involved with as well, was adopted by the Labour Party, by the Liberal Democrats, indeed by the Conservative Party in Scotland. My colleagues in the Conservative Party in Westminster did not adopt it. And I think this is the first stage. What that definition will look like is very much up to what the Deputy Prime Minister, where she wants to take it. Even as a member of the APPG, I'm not entirely wedded to that definition, just like Runnymede are not entirely wedded to their definition. This is about bringing together the work that's already been done in the Runnymede Trust, in the All-Party Parliamentary Group and others, to basically say it's time to say to a community of 4 million, 6% of our nation, that actually you do deserve to be of equal worth and value and to be protected, and for institutions, particularly public institutions, to know what the parameters are of this new and pernicious form of racism.
OK, well, you mentioned the definition of Islamophobia. I'll just read it out. Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. You said you were open to that being changed. What would you change about that?
I think it's a good definition, and I think if the government were to adopt that definition in its entirety, with all the explanatory notes that go with it, then I think that would be a start. But I'm also open to the fact that what is important here is that this community feel protected and feel that certainly in the workplace they are of equal worth and value, and that this new form of racism, and it is a pernicious form of racism, is recognised and understood. I think much of the debates about the definition have been really straw men arguments. Oh, it's about blasphemy. Well, no, it's not, because it's not about changing the law, and it's not about protecting Islam or protecting a religion or any religion. It's about protecting people who are believers or perceived to be believers. I mean, what's interesting in this country is that a lot of Islamophobic attacks are not actually directed at Muslims. They're often directed at Sikhs or people with turbans who are perceived to be Muslims, or attacks on gurdwaras because they're perceived to be mosques. You know, the thing about most racists is that they're also not very bright people. So I think it's really important for us to say that these straw men arguments that are being put up, unfortunately, by certain think tanks, including organisations like Policy Exchange, need to be dismissed. And what's important for the government to do is to look at how the community deserves something that allows them to be protected.
OK, well, some of the criticisms of a definition of Islamophobia is that it is too broad and would basically suppress criticism. Matthew, do you think we need a definition, an official definition? And if so, is that one that I read out from the APPG the one?
The definition needs to be narrow, and the key thing is the interpretation. I totally respect Saida's right to believe in Islam, and I'm sure you would defend my right to say that it's a belief in a fictional deity in the sky that we should be able to mock and laugh at in the same way that we can laugh us atheists at Christians and other ideologies that have caused great damage to our world. I've just come back from the Middle East. Religion is at the heart of this terrible tragedy that's unfolding there, as it has been in many other places. And I want to be able to see, like the Book of Mormon, a wonderful satire on a particular variant of a religion. And what I loved about this particular artistic endeavour is that the programme of the first ever showing of the Book of Mormon, the Mormons took out an ad saying, look, if you disagree with this, come and meet us. They didn't feel they needed to intimidate these people. They recognised that in a liberal society, people have a right to offend other people for their religious beliefs, even if they're precious to them. That is how cultural evolution, how societies change and benefit. And I worry a lot that there is, I think, a sense of cultural intimidation. I doubt that, I don't know if you would agree, that something as satirical about Islam would have easily been made into a big West End production.
I mean, I agree with almost everything that you've said. And what's fascinating is that if you look at what Kenneth Stern, who was one of the original architects of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, says, he actually worked on that definition and then said, but I'm also concerned about certain organisations, including governments, adopting it because it has been weaponised by extremist Israelis, and that there will always be a weaponisation of a definition to pursue political ends. Could that definition be weaponised? Of course it could. Is the IHRA definition weaponised? Of course it is. But what we must have is in this country one consistency of treatment between different forms of racism and prejudice. What we must also have is non-legally binding spaces, places, definitions where we can start to talk about this form of racism. Look at the statistics. I mean, nobody can doubt after what happened in the summer and the 70% rise that we've seen of anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobic attacks simply over the last 12 months that were reported only last week. There is no doubt this is a real and growing issue, and government, I am pleased, is taking it seriously. And certainly I know that there are many people across the political divide who are wanting to work collaboratively with government to make sure we come forward with something that doesn't suppress free speech, free debate, satire, comedy, discussion, all of those things, but also protects Muslim communities in this country.
Right, I mean, Peter, do we need the definition in order to be able to tackle anti-Muslim hatred?
Of course, you can't tackle something when you can't even define it. And that's why, in 2016, when the then Conservative government came forward with a definition of anti-Semitism after a rise in anti-Semitic attacks, they were absolutely right to do so. This shouldn't be controversial. We just heard a great example there of a respectful discussion between two people who have different religious beliefs, but nevertheless both agree that incitement of violence against Muslims should have no place in British society. That's the kind of discussion we should be having, not cheap attacks from the leader of the opposition or others who demean their office when they simplify a complex but important issue down to a cheap political point-scoring exercise.
Right, I mean, Harriet, Kemi Badenoch has talked about this being a route to introduce blasphemy laws through the back door. Peter's saying it shouldn't be controversial.
Well, I think you've got to keep as the fundamental principles, and we've had exactly that in this discussion here today, the great leadership in our country in terms of freedom of religion and belief, not just in the UK but around the world, and also the freedom of speech. And so personally, I prefer the word anti-Muslim hatred, because I think, as Sayeeda acknowledged, you don't want to have something that confuses in minds of people who might have racist behaviours, a religious belief and racial characteristics. So I think that's where the care needs to be brought to this, just as you get people calling out when people are anti-Semitic, when in fact they should be disagreeing with some of the actions of the Israeli government. And so it's really important to be careful in this area, but to make sure that the things that make the UK so special in terms of freedom of religion and belief and freedom of speech are not threatened.
Right, I mean, you say to be careful in this area, but your leader is talking about this being a way to introduce blasphemy laws through the back door. I mean, do you disagree with that?
I think what she's highlighting there is that the risk that of it being potentially an area where that might happen, and to be careful that we don't allow that to happen.
OK, I mean, Sayeeda...
man argument,
OK,
right?
well, what about the idea of calling it anti-Muslim hatred rather than Islamophobia? I mean, focusing on the people rather than...
Well, it's anti-Muslim racism. Like, whether you call it Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, I call it pink bananas as far as I'm bothered about, the kind of term. These are straw man arguments. We have spent a decade talking about the word, and all the while, anti-Muslim racism is on the increase. More Muslims are facing hatred, aggression, violence, microaggressions in the workplace. This is happening on a daily basis. And I think, like I said in my book recently, I'm done. I'm done with trying to explain and caveat and justify and try and explain and educate people on these issues. We are talking here about the lived experiences of people. My family, my father who came here, worked in the mills, helped build this country. My grandfathers who came to having served in the British Indian Army, having defended this country. We're talking about my child who's back in the military, in the armed forces, in uniform. We're talking about their everyday lived experiences, where there are people in this country, including tragically in our politics, who are consistently sending out this message that you do not belong, you do not matter, you are different, you are other, you are going to be held to higher standards than everybody else. It has to stop.
Matthew, you wanted to come back.
Well, I am half Pakistani, half Welsh. It's quite an unusual combination. My dad came here from Pakistan to study law, met my mum. And so I experienced a lot of racism growing up in the 70s and 80s. The P word was used not just by students, but by the teachers. And the national front of the football stadiums giving out leaflets. I never could support. I'm going to Brentford tonight. It's wonderful these days at football. But back then, the P word, the N word was endemic. So I'm really pleased with how society has broadly in this country become, I think, tolerant and willing to judge people on the basis of their characteristics and character rather than their colour or anything arbitrary. But having said that, I think there's been a couple of things. Identity politics has been a disaster. Trying to define ourselves through narrow identity groups where there's apparently no bridge to the experiences of other people in different verticals. I think that's been really bad. And I'm worried about an uplift in, for example, the Tommy Robinson, who has criticised Islam and all Muslims. This is a very various group. There are some moderates. The Islamists, I think, are a massive danger to this country and to the wider world. These are the fundamentalists. I want to go after those people. But tarnishing everybody according to a single label is just deeply irrational.
But isn't that exactly what a definition of Islamophobia is trying to stop? It's tarnishing all Muslims.
On how it's used and how it's interpreted. I think it needs to be narrow, and it needs to be interpreted in the way that protects the great liberal traditions of free speech.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important point to make. Look, if you weaponize a religion, if you effectively politicize a religion, whether that's Islamism or Zionism, political ideologies do not need protection. But what we do need is we need to protect people who are believers or perceived to be believers. What's fascinating, actually, is that, interestingly, that, you know, many people who are attacked on our streets are from different religions. You know, some of the most vicious attacks in this country, anti-Muslim hatred attacks, aren't against Muslims. So this isn't actually about just protecting a religious community, and it's certainly not about protecting a religion. It's about creating a level playing field where everybody in this country feels like they're of equal worth and value.
OK. We are keeping our eye on the House of Commons. Parliament. Prime Minister's question is going to be coming up at 12 o'clock in about 5 minutes or so. Keir Starmer, after his encounter with Kemi Badenoch in the Commons, is going to be heading to Washington, preparing for his meeting with Donald Trump tomorrow. Let us have a look at something that Donald Trump has posted this morning on his Truth social account. Right, so this is an AI-generated video, it seems, that Donald Trump has posted on his social media account. It has been knocking around on social media since President Trump announced his plan for the US to take over Gaza, relocate Palestinians to neighbouring Arab countries and turn the Strip into a resort. And this is a video that he has posted, an AI-generated video, it seems, apparently promoting his idea. I mean, Saida, can I start with your reaction to that?
I mean, how do you even react to that? I mean, that is just some sort of weird spoof bromance thing going on between the President of the United States, Elon Musk, and Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, I looked at that. Somebody sent it to me and I went, that's not real. Come on. And I had to
Well, it's not real.
Back.
I mean, it is AI generated.
Yeah. That is not posted by Donald Trump from his official account. That's what I meant by surely this can't be real. And I looked and it was. And that's the world we now live in.
Peter, this is the man that Keir Starmer has to engage with tomorrow on a serious level, talking about these issues. I mean, we've talked a lot about what he's going to say on Ukraine. He's also got to discuss the situation in the Middle East.
Well, I'm sure he'll be setting out the UK's position, which is quite simply that we want to see the ceasefire maintained. It was a ceasefire that Donald Trump played a huge role in getting over the line. And we want to see it as the start of a process to a lasting peace in the region with an independent and sovereign Palestine living, a Palestinian state living alongside a safe and secure Israel.
What is he going to say to him about this idea to turn Gaza into a resort and actually promoting that idea through videos like this?
Well, as I say, you know, our position is clear. We want to see a two-state solution.
Right, and will Keir Starmer articulate that to Donald Trump tomorrow?
Well, that's obviously something to ask Keir Starmer, but that is the government's position, and I'm sure he'll be sticking firm by that.
Harriet?
Well, can I just highlight the fact that there are still, I think, 60 hostages being held by the terrorist organisation Hamas, and progress in this part of the world, which we all sincerely want to see, has to start with the release of those hostages. President Trump, in his first term, made major progress in terms of something called the Abraham Accords, which was the Arab states beginning to recognise the right of the State of Israel to exist. I hope that he will continue to pursue this in his second term as president, because I think it's an important part of moving forward to a better future for Palestinians and Israelis to live peacefully alongside each other.
Matthew, how should Keir Starmer deal with President Trump when he's posting things like this on social media the day before he's due to sit down with him?
It's not easy. I hadn't seen that video. It's shocking, but it's part of a wider gamut of shocking interventions that Trump has made. I think Trump is reprehensible. The way he's thrown Ukraine under the bus, this plan for ethnic cleansing in Gaza, disastrous. But I would just say this. There is an explanation for Trump's emergence as a major political player, and part of it is European nations and European politicians have completely and reprehensibly failed to pay for defence. We've outsourced it to American taxpayers who have picked up the bill. We've been warned about it by successive presidents, from Eisenhower through Kennedy, Reagan, Clinton and beyond. The cumulative amount is in the billions running into trillions of dollars. And this is a megaphone to wake up Europe, and it's not working. 2.5% of GDP, Starmer has announced. America is spending 3.4%. Poland at 4.5%.
Right. Well, I mean,
we're living in a complete dream world about the threat we face.
It has been welcomed by the US Defence Secretary. We can see a tweet by Pete Hegseth there saying he got off the phone with the Defence Secretary John Healey, who confirmed they will increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, eventually much further. That promise to get to 3% sometime in the next Parliament. He describes it as a strong step from an enduring partner.
They are probably saying...
Right, Matthew, Keir Starmer's on his feet. Let's go to the comments.
Of Ukraine. The courage of the Ukrainians is inspiring, and across this House we stand with them for as long as it takes. Mr. Speaker, that's why we're increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by April 2027, with an ambition to reach 3% in the next Parliament as economic and fiscal conditions allow. And this afternoon, of course, I will travel to the US to have discussions with President Trump about the enduring security partnership between our two countries. Mr. Speaker, I'm also delighted that we've announced the first 750 schools to start offering free breakfast clubs. This is our plan for change in action, ensuring every child has the chance to thrive. And Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in thanking Amanda Pritchard for her services as Chief Executive of the NHS England, and I wish her well for the future. This morning, Mr. Speaker, I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Dr. Luca.
Could the Prime Minister tell this House whether the outcome of his budget was by design or by mistake? Did he mean to push 100,000 pensioners into poverty with his own analysis when he removed the winter fuel allowance, or was that a mistake? Did he mean to decimate family farming when he changed the inheritance tax, or was that a mistake? And did he mean to tax GPs, care homes and hospices when he raised NICs, or was that a mistake? Prime Minister, could he tell the House, are these acceptable collateral damage in his path for change, or simply a mistake that need rectifying?
I'll tell you what was a mistake, leaving a £22 billion black hole that we had to sort out. We took the difficult decisions, investing in our NHS, and I would have thought he would have welcomed the 2 million extra appointments that we've achieved in the first 7 months of a Labour government. That's the difference our budget is making to people.
Alex McIntyre.
Delighted that Carlton and Grange primary schools in my city of Gloucester will be part of the first 750 schools to get free breakfast clubs. And I'm pleased that this government is already delivering on its manifesto promises in less than a year. So will the Prime Minister agree with me that by helping working parents with childcare and delivering the best start to the day for every single child, we are delivering opportunity for the next generation?
Well, I agree with my honourable friend. We're pleased that 2 of the early adopter schools will be in his constituency. And, Mr. Speaker, we're ensuring that all primary school children aged can get access to free breakfast and at least 30 minutes of free childcare. And that means every child ready to learn, and parents, of course, supported with up to £450 a year back in their pockets. That's the change a Labour government makes.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Bennell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish the Prime Minister every success on his trip to Washington. The visit to see President Trump must serve our national interest. The Prime Minister and I are completely united in our support for Ukraine as a proud and sovereign nation. Yeah. What specific steps will he take to ensure Ukraine is at the negotiating table for any peace settlement?
Well, I thank her for her words about the forthcoming trip. And it is right, and I think the whole House will think it's right, that Ukraine must be at the table at negotiations. There can be no negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine. That has been my consistent position in all of the discussions that I've had. That will continue to be my position, because this is about the sovereignty of Ukraine and their ability to decide for themselves the future of their country. So they must be at the table.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for that answer, and as I said, I wish him every success. We want to support him on this issue. So turning to the details of the plan he set out yesterday. Over the weekend, I suggested to the Prime Minister that he cut the aid budget, and I'm pleased that he accepted my advice. Mr. Speaker, it's the fastest response. It's the fastest response I've ever had from the Prime Minister. However, he announced £13.4 billion in additional defence spending yesterday. This morning, his Defence Secretary said the uplift is only £6 billion, which is the correct figure.
Prime Minister.
I'm going to have to let the Leader of the Opposition down gently. She didn't feature in my thinking at all. I was so busy over the weekend I didn't even see her proposal. I think she's appointed herself, I think, saviour of the Western civilization. It's a desperate search for relevance. But, Mr. Speaker, look, if you take the numbers for this financial year and then the numbers for the financial year 27-28, that's £13.4 billion increase. That is the largest sustained increase in defence spending since the Cold War, which will put us in a position to ensure the security and defence of our country and of Europe.
Mr. Speaker, that wasn't very clear. How is it that the Defence Secretary says £6 billion and he says £13.4 billion? The IFS said today that the government is playing silly games with numbers. How does he find this difference in numbers?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we went through this 2 weeks ago, going through the same question over and over again. So let me say it. If you take the financial year this year, and then you take the financial year for 2027-28, the difference between the two is £13.4 billion. That's the same answer. If you ask again, I'll give the same answer again.
I'll decide when it's more.
Mr. Speaker, someone needs to tell the Prime Minister that being patronising is not a substitute. Not a substitute for answering questions. It's not a substitute. He hasn't answered. What he has said is different from what he said yesterday. We are still not clear where the money is coming from. We want to support him. He's also said that we should put British troops on the ground in Ukraine. We haven't seen the detail of any proposals. Would his new spending plans allow him to fund this commitment effectively?
Prime Minister.
I mean, I think it's the same question again. It's £13.4 billion. That's the difference between this year and 2020. She asked a serious question about the security guarantees in Ukraine, and that is extremely important, because the worst of all outcomes, if there's to be a cessation of hostilities, is that it is a short break rather than sustained and lasting peace. And I think that that means there's got to be security guarantees. I've indicated that we will play our full part. There has to be US backing, because otherwise I don't think it will deter Putin. We are working on that. I'm having extensive discussions about it, not in a position to put details before the House, as she well knows today, but I'll continue down that route, because I want a lasting peace in Ukraine and Europe for the safety and security of Ukrainians, of Europeans, and of course for everybody in this country.
Mr. Speaker, this is an endeavour that we want to support him in, but we need to know exactly what it is we're supporting. We need clarity and transparency over the money. We also need to know where this money is going. This morning, the Defence Secretary could not say if the Chagos deal would come out of the defence budget. Can he confirm to the House that none of the defence uplift includes payments for his Chagos deal?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the additional spend I announced yesterday is for our capability on defence and security in Europe, as I made absolutely clear yesterday. The Chagos deal is extremely important for our security, for US security. The US are rightly looking at it. When it's finalised, I'll put it before the House with the costings. The figures being bandied around are absolutely wild of the mark. The deal is well over a century, but the funding I announced yesterday is for our capability to put ourselves in a position to rise to a generational challenge. That is what that money is all about, and I thought she supported it.
Speaker, we need to make sure we are supporting a plan that is clear and transparent. Yesterday, the Prime Minister set an ambition for defence spending to reach 3% in the next Parliament. We agree with him, but this could be 2034, almost a decade away. That is too slow. We don't know how he will pay for it. We cannot raise taxes further. We already pay more on debt interest than defence, and everyone in this House would have heard him not answer the last question. So I will ask him again. Is he paying for the Chagos deal with this defence uplift or not?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, I've just dealt with that question. She gave her... The money announced yesterday is going to our capability to put ourselves in a position to defend the security of our country, Europe and the UK. And she asked about defence spending. She gave what people have described as a rambling speech yesterday when she couldn't say what defence spending should be. We've been absolutely clear. We've set it out, a full, credible, costed plan, and I thought she supported it.
Holly Billington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware that in coastal communities like mine in East Thanet, people develop cancer earlier, get treated and diagnosed later and die younger. Can he give the House an update on the plans for the government to implement the recommendations by the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, into tackling poor health in our seaside towns?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank her for raising this. She's right that cancer patients are waiting too long for diagnosis and for treatment. Addressing healthcare inequity is part of our 10-year health plan, Mr. Speaker, aiming to halve the gap in healthy life expectancy between the richest and the poorest regions. And we're making progress on that already.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I start by wishing the Prime Minister well on his trip to the White House. It won't be an easy meeting, but we're all behind him for our national interest. But it's already clear that under President Trump, we won't be able to rely on the United States, sadly, to help ensure our security against Russian aggression. And that's why we strongly welcome the Prime Minister's decision to increase Britain's defence spending. But Europe must do far more to rearm in the face of Putin's threat, and the UK must lead on that. That's why we back the idea of a new European rearmament bank, so we can finance a big increase in the manufacturing capacity without the need to cut Britain's vital soft power. So will the Prime Minister look at this idea, work across this House and across Europe, so we can make a European rearmament bank actually happen?
Prime Minister.
I'll resist his suggestion that we've got somehow to choose between the US and our European partners. I do not believe that to be the case, and I want to strengthen our already strong relationship with the US, because I think it's vital that we do so. I, of course, want to work with our European allies on defence capability and what more we need to do in relation to capability, coordination and funding. And in the longer term, there is a discussion going on amongst allies as to future funding. We're part of that discussion, and I'm happy to share that with the House as it evolves.
Sir Ed Davey.
I hope he's successful in keeping the US on board with our European allies, and I'm glad he's talking about finance and defence. I think if he was to push this European rearmament bank at the summit on Sunday, the European leaders, I think he'd be pushing an open door. Certainly, Prime Minister Tusk is supporting from the Polish point of view. But, Mr. Speaker, if I can turn now to domestic matters and the cost of living crisis that's hitting so many of our constituents. Families in my constituency are really angry that Thames Water is sending them bills this April that will cost them £150 a year more. Thames has already let down so many people, whether it's leaking pipes or pumping their filthy sewage into our rivers. A third of customers' bills are already used just to pay the interest on Thames Water's debt, and now it's going to borrow £3 billion more. Isn't it time to stop making people pay for bailing out the vulture funds drowning Thames Water in debt? Will his government just put this firm out of its misery, put it into special administration so we can sort out that mess and the mess that lot left.
Well, he's certainly right about the mess that lot made. We've obviously got the water bill. It's got very strong measures in it, and I think he supports them.
Not Rosanna Allen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have heard extraordinary rhetoric coming out of Washington in recent days, and we have seen fascist salutes on our screens. We have witnessed wild statements about Palestinians being expelled from Gaza, and we have seen our allies labelled dictators. Britain's interests are best served by standing with Ukraine, working closely with our European allies, by upholding international law and remaining a strong part of NATO. Can the Prime Minister assure us that this will form a central part of his message when he meets world leaders this week?
Minister. Well, we certainly stand with Ukraine, and I think I speak for the whole House when I say that. And as I set out yesterday, NATO is the bedrock of our security. It's been our most important alliance for many, many years, as important today as it's ever been. And we build that alliance by working with the US. We have a special and deep relationship with the US. That's not just words, that's to do with security, defence, intelligence capability, vitally important for both sides. But we also work with our European allies, and it is that ability to work with the US and the EU and European partners that has held the peace for so many years and needs to hold the peace for many years to come.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prior to the election, the Labour Party promised to reduce energy bills by £300, yet on their watch, energy bills are about to increase by almost £300. So may I ask, is the failure to keep that promise a consequence of government incompetency, or have the Labour Party been caught lying to the public?
Hear, hear. Well, Mr. Speaker, we're very proud of the fact that we are pushing forward for energy independence, which will keep our bills lower. And he knows very well what my position is. But I note that, again, he's very quiet on the SNP record. And I'll tell you for why. Just this week, we've seen the attainment gap widen in Scotland, pupils leaving schools with no qualifications rising, those from deprived areas going to work falling. Instead of playing the politics of grievance, they need to take responsibility for their own record.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Mike Addison was one of a kind, a physical disability rugby league world champion with England and Warrington Wolves, and an avid volunteer for the club and foundation. He was a friend to everyone who knew him. Tragically, he died at age 45, having taken his own life. One death by suicide is too many, and every suicide is preventable. But ONS data puts the rate in the North West at over double the rate of London, and with a 17% increase last year. So can the Prime Minister outline what more can be done working across government to help Warrington meet our target of eliminating suicide?
Prime Minister. Well, can I thank her for raising this tragic case? And my thoughts, I'm sure the thoughts of the House, are with the family, friends and teammates of Mike at Warrington Wolves. I mean, she's right, Mr. Speaker, that one death by suicide is one too many, and reducing the number is a vital part of our health mission. We are recruiting an additional 8,500 mental health workers, especially trained to support people at risk of suicide. We're committed to taking forward the suicide prevention strategy for England. I'm sure this is something the whole House will support.
Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement committing us to increased defence spending and reaffirming the UK's support for Ukraine and their democratically elected leader, President Zelensky. A wartime leader, like Winston Churchill, who also had to delay elections because his country faced an existential threat. As the Prime Minister travels to Washington, with this House and the country willing him to succeed, will he invoke the legacy of Churchill in making the case for the UK to be the key in bridging transatlantic relations, to bring us all together for the sake of freedom and democracy across the world?
Prime Minister.
I thank him for his question. Can I pick up on both elements? Because President Zelensky is a democratically elected leader. and suspending elections was precisely what we did in this country when we were fighting in the Second World War. And secondly, on his point, yes, I do think that the UK has successfully been a bridge between the US and Europe for many, many years. It's vital that we continue in that role, and that's why my message to President Trump is that the relationship between our two countries needs to go from strength to strength. It's all very strong, but also working at the same time with our European allies.
Jessica T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday night, there was a brutal double stabbing in my constituency. This adds to a long line of horrific knife attacks that have included 3 fatalities over the past 2 years. I know the Prime Minister is aware of the particular challenges we face in Bournemouth, and while crime has been going down, I know there is much more he will want to do. So will he join me in praising the crucial work that organisations like Changes Are Made, who give positive activities like boxing to young people, and will he share what more the government can do to tackle knife crime in communities like mine?
Prime Minister.
Thank you for raising this really important issue. Yesterday we introduced our crime and policing bill, which is central to our plan for change and halving knife crime. It involves new powers to seize and destroy knives found on private property and a new criminal offence of possessing a bladed article with intent to cause harm. Plus, Mr. Speaker, tougher penalties for selling dangerous weapons to under-18s, stricter rules for online sales under Ronan's law, and we'll continue with that work.
Rankin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The floods of 2013-14 devastated Datchet, Horton and Wraysbury, and the flooding last January wasn't much better. But shockingly, the River Thames scheme as currently proposed continues to leave my constituents at risk. The council was asked to cough up tens of millions, but like very many, is cash-strapped. Does the Prime Minister, therefore, agree with me that the only option to protect my constituents is funding Channel 1 of the River Thames scheme as a national strategic infrastructure, which it really is?
Prime Minister.
Well, I know the honourable member has raised this issue before, and it's obviously an important issue for his constituents. We inherited flood defences in their worst state on record, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we're investing £2.6 billion to protect over 50,000 properties. I understand that the options to reduce flood risk to these communities are being considered as part of the Datchet and Hythe End Flood Alleviation Scheme, and I'll ensure that he has a meeting with the relevant minister to take forward the work.
Sally Jameson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In order for the government's growth agenda to be a success, it must be felt in all areas of the country, including Doncaster and South Yorkshire, where we have green growth transport companies, including hybrid air vehicles and clean power hydrogen, alongside the reopening of Doncaster Sheffield Airport. So will the Prime Minister put on his record support for Mayor Ros Jones, who has led on the airport reopening, and also set out how the growth agenda will override those traditional patterns of investment mainly in the south of England and bring prosperity to South Yorkshire and indeed the north as a whole?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I will. Doncaster's got a proud industrial heritage, rail, steel and coal, an extraordinary potential for industries of the future, from hydrogen to AI. And we are focused, Mr. Speaker, on devolving more power and funding to metro mayors to support regional industry. And we will work with the mayors of Doncaster and South Yorkshire to support efforts to reopen Doncaster Sheffield Airport.
Graham Lamberter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the privilege to represent the home of Speyside malts, some amongst the finest Scotch whiskies. Last week, the UK Government unveiled damaging plans to grant a different definition of single malt to English producers to that of Scottish single malts. This is entirely inconsistent with the global reputation of the quality of single malts and seeks to tear up a well-established definition of what a single malt is, pulling the rug yet further from underneath the Scotch whisky industry. Given the backlash from the industry to this and the damage this could cause to Scotch whisky exports and jobs, will the Prime Minister's word on whisky be his whisky bond by backing the industry to the hilt and scrapping these plans?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we do support Scotch whisky. It's a really important part of our economy, and that's why we allocated £5 million in the budget, and why we're working with Brazil, which is worth £25 million for Scotch whisky. It's what we're doing to support industry and sectors in Scotland. And in addition to that, in another sector, at the weekend I was very pleased to be able to announce the £200 million investment in Grangemouth and the future for generations there.
Steve Brace. Speaker, yesterday I returned from Ukraine, having spent 4 days with a cross-party delegation of parliamentarians. The Ukrainians we met from across society had one simple message. They were deeply thankful for our partnership, and they want us to know that they can overcome the Russian invasion because they must. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that alongside our welcome 100-year partnership, now is the time for the UK to redouble our efforts alongside our European partners to help secure Ukraine's future as a free, democratic and sovereign European nation?
Yes, I do, and I'm really proud of the way the United Kingdom has risen to the challenge of the last 3 years in a united way, both in terms of the capability and funding that we provided to Ukraine, but also the throwing open of homes here for those fleeing. And I was privileged to welcome some of the families to Downing Street on Monday, and it was a human reminder of the impact that it's having on them, their children and their families.
Dr. Kieran Mellon.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The whole House wants the Prime Minister's meeting with President Trump to be a success, which requires credibility on our defence spending commitments. The Leader of the Opposition gave the Prime Minister an opportunity to unambiguously rule out the funding of any Chagos deal coming from the defence budget, and I'm not clear that he did that. I want him to be taken seriously in Washington, so I'll make it really easy for him. Will he rule out the funding of any Chagos deal coming from the defence budget, yes or no?
Yes. Prime Minister.
Speaker, as I said, when the deal is complete, I will put it before the House with the costings. The money yesterday was allocated to our capability, the single biggest increase, sustained increase in defence spending since the Cold War.
Diane Abbott.
The whole country stands behind the people of Ukraine. But there is also a view that taking money from aid and development to spend on armaments and tanks makes people less safe, not more safe, because the desperation and the poverty that so often leads to warfare is what aid and development money is supposed to counter.
Mr. Speaker, as I said yesterday, the overseas development is important. I'm proud of what we've done. It wasn't a decision I took lightly or I wanted to take, but it is important at this moment that we put the defence spending, the defence and security of our country and Europe uppermost. We will, of course, make sure that we're able to fulfil our humanitarian obligations in relation to Gaza, Ukraine and Sudan and other vital work. And I want to be clear that we do, of course, want to go back and increase that funding as soon as we're able to do so.
Simon Hoare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope the Prime Minister knows that when he does travel to Washington to meet the former leader of the free world, he does so with the hopes and prayers of this House and the country. Probably no more serious a meeting could be taking place. Now, whilst Ukraine will clearly dominate, will the Prime Minister undertake to raise with President Trump that Canada is a valued, respected and much-loved member of both NATO and our Commonwealth, and that this childish nonsense of a 51st state should be called out by the Prime Minister for what it is?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this issue. UK and Canada are close allies and have been for a very long time, with a partnership based on a shared history and a shared set of values and a determination to be an active force for good in the world. We work closely with them on issues of the Commonwealth, on NATO and, of course, Five Eyes, intelligence sharing, and we will work to strengthen that relationship.
Michelle Scrocton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Barrow-in-Furness has always been ahead of the times in terms of high-skilled engineering. In light of the Prime Minister's historic commitment to rise defence spending, the biggest increase since the end of the Cold War, I invite him to visit and see the many SMEs who could support this vital supply chain. Does he agree that investing in these businesses will not only deliver our nuclear deterrent, but improve security and the economy for us all?
Well, I thank her for raising this question, and we'll obviously consider her invitation. Defence spending, Mr Speaker, already supports more than 430,000 jobs across the United Kingdom, and I'd like to recognise the contribution made by the workers in Barrow and Furness.
Mr Speaker, in my constituency, the planning inspector chose to use the term grey belt to pass a battery energy storage system application before the order was laid in this House to change the NPPF, and without recognising the moratorium for local authorities to manage their local plans. This decision failed to recognise the green belt that protects us against urban sprawl, and it failed to recognise the proximity to a school, a church and a graveyard. So can the Prime Minister define what grey belt actually is, or is it simply a grey area to allow for inappropriate development?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm not across the details of the individual case that she raises, as she will understand, but I am in favour of making sure that we can have the infrastructure and the houses that we need to grow our economy. And one of the problems we had in the last 14 years was an assertion or rhetoric that we wanted homes and infrastructure, but when the decision all that came up, the answer was always no. The answer cannot always be no.
John McDonnell.
Can I thank the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary for their efforts to secure the release of Allah Abdel Fattah, the human rights campaigner, the British human rights campaigner, who's been imprisoned in Egypt now for over 10 years. The Prime Minister will know, because he's met the family, that his mother is on the 150th day of her hunger strike and her health is failing rapidly. Could I ask the Prime Minister to pick up the phone to President Sisi and seek the release of Allah to save his life, also that of his mother's?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this really important case, and as he says, I did meet the mother and the family just a few days ago, and it is an incredibly difficult situation for them, and I can assure him I will do everything I can to ensure the release in this case, and that includes phone calls as necessary. I've raised it before, I'll raise it again, we raise it and will continue to do so. I gave my word to the family that that's what I do, that I will do, and I will.
Hannah.
People in Northern Ireland are sick to the teeth of paramilitaries, of the menace, of the sectarianism and of keeping people stuck in the past. In light of the announcement yesterday on transition, does the Prime Minister recognise that people will be highly sceptical of this process, that there must be real learnings from the failed transitions of the past, that there can be no rewards for paramilitaries for hanging on, robust criminal justice, the flags off the lampposts and on street corners, and community-funded policing to allow communities that have been brutalised by paramilitaries to finally look forward to a confident and shared future?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank you for raising this important and obviously sensitive issue? We are committed to making progress towards ending paramilitarism once and for all in Northern Ireland, and that's why we've agreed to support a short independent exercise to look at a formal process, and I'll make sure that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland keeps her updated.
Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, prostate cancer is now our country's most common cancer, and yet there is no national screening programme. We made progress towards this in government, but yet there is more to do, which is why I'm delighted to have joined Prostate Cancer Research, the charity, as an ambassador. I'm grateful to the Health Secretary for his engagement thus far, and could I ask the Prime Minister to ensure that we do have a targeted national screening programme for the most at-risk groups of prostate cancer, so that we can not only save the NHS money, make progress towards the government's early diagnosis targets, but most crucially, save thousands of lives?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank him for raising this, and can I thank him for using his authority and reputation to support this vital cause, which will make a material difference, and I look forward to working with him on it. We do share a commitment to detecting prostate cancer earlier and treating it faster, and we must do that. Our National Cancer Plan will improve the way we treat cancer right across the country, and I'll make sure he's fully informed of the steps that we're taking, and we'll work with him.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will the Prime Minister join with me in wishing all Welsh citizens everywhere a very happy St David's Day on Saturday? And will he also join with me in welcoming the latest news of the £600 million investment by Copenhagen infrastructure partners to ensure that Bute Energy and Green Gen Cymru can take forward the bold ambition to achieve 100% green electricity production by 2035 in Wales, thus providing much-needed sustainable green jobs for the people of Wales?
Prime Minister. Well, can I wish her and her constituents a very happy St David's Day and join her in welcoming this significant new investment into her constituency that will ensure good jobs, well-paid, skilled jobs, and, of course, the transition to energy security and lower bills. And I know her constituency will play a vital role in that.
Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree that our biggest single foreign policy priority is the preservation of NATO with America at its heart? And if so, following his welcome announcement yesterday, is the next step to talk to our European allies and for all of us to agree to spend 3% of GDP on defence within a specified timescale so that we can look the President in the eye and say that Europe is finally pulling its weight on defence?
Prime Minister.
Well, I agree with him entirely in terms of the priority in terms of NATO. Putin thought he could weaken NATO. He's only made it stronger and larger. NATO's strength comes from the US and European partners and others working together, and that is absolutely the focus of my work at the moment. It is right, as he says, that European countries, including the United Kingdom, do need to do more on capability, on coordination, and on defence spend. That must be not seen as a project separate to NATO, but part of an essential project that ensures that NATO is there for decades and decades to come, preserving the peace, just as it has been for 75 years.
That was the former Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, there, asking one of the final questions at Prime Minister's Questions. Well, I'm joined now here in the studio by Ian Murray, the Scotland Secretary, Helen Whately, the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, and Vicky Young, our Deputy Political Editor. So, Vicky, at Prime Minister's Questions, we had Kemi Badenoch going really on defence spending, on Keir Starmer's claims yesterday of what was going to be saved from the foreign aid budget to go into the defence budget. There was a bit of a row about the numbers. Just explain for us what this row was about.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Kemi Badenoch yesterday making it clear that actually she and the Conservative Party do agree with the whole idea of raising defence spending, and she made the point that she herself had suggested that actually one way of funding it was to cut the overseas aid budget. So she broadly agrees, therefore she was almost really trying to find a way to criticise it, and one of those ways is through this suggestion. So the claim by Sir Keir Starmer yesterday is that this uplift for defence would amount to £13.4 billion a year. Now, others claim that actually it's £6 billion a year. So what's happened here is that if you take what we spend now, this year, and compare it with what it will be in 27-28, the difference is indeed around £13 billion. But that is assuming that there was no suggestion that defence spending would rise at all between now and then. And that really is pretty implausible, because if it wasn't going to be rising, it would actually be a cut. And there was no suggestion that was going to happen. In fact, there were plans already to raise spending. So the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said that that figure of £13.4 billion was misleadingly large. And it does seem like, you know, it was an unnecessary row. I mean, there was no need to claim this. You know, there was certainly a pretty hefty rise in defence spending. You know, why not just stick with that figure?
I mean, well, Ian, why not? This was a hugely important announcement. Why not just give a straightforward figure? It was misleading.
Well, the figure we spend on defence today and the figure we'll spend on in that financial year is £13.4 billion larger. That's the figure that gets us to that 2.5% of GDP.
But it's not going to be £13.4 billion extra, is it? Because defence spending would have gone up in line with inflation, in line with economic growth anyway.
But I think the really important thing is what the IFS said on this is a very minor point compared to the gravity and the historic significance of the announcement that was made yesterday. And yes, people will fight over figures, of course they will. That's what the Leader of the Opposition's job is to try and hold government to
account and scrutinise government, and we appreciate that, and that's her job. But the bottom line here is we should not be diverted from the historic significance of yesterday's announcement, which was to increase defence spending to 2.5% to protect our borders, the borders of Europe, and to make sure that we're unstinting in our support for NATO.
Well, it sounds like, Keir Starmer has potentially muddied the waters on that by confusing his figures. Helen...
Well, the figures haven't been confused. Let's be quite clear. We spend £66.3 billion today, and we'll spend £79.7 billion in that financial year. That's £13.4 billion extra. That figure has not been disputed.
OK, well, the IFS, as I said, described it as misleading. Helen, your leader, Kemi Badenoch, couldn't even come up with a figure to what percentage of GDP she wants to spend on defence spending.
So the point here is that Kemi had said, and particularly the weekend in the run-up to Keir Starmer's announcement yesterday, that we wanted to see more spent on defence, and one place to go would be to shift spending.
She didn't say how much
budget
more.
So the fact is, Keir Starmer is the Prime Minister, and he's the person who needs to be making these decisions. I think it was unhelpful the way he set it out yesterday, because as Vicky explained, it's kind of created this whole debate about the figures. And what it looks like more is actually yesterday he was announcing an extra £6 billion spending on defence, there or thereabouts. And that is important. And as we're quite clear, we support that. That is the right thing to do.
Is it enough?
But he should be straight with the public about this. The other thing which I think he also was not straight about, and he was asked both by Kemi twice during PMQs and then also by a backbencher, was does that spending include the cost of the Chagos deal? So we disagree with that. We don't think he should be doing that deal. We think that's bad for our national security. It's also going to cost the taxpayer. And I heard his answer 3 times to that. He gave the same answer 3 times, but I still don't think he answered the question, is the cost of the Chagos deal going to come from that increased defence spending?
Ian, is it?
The debate about defence spending was to get to 2.5%. That's what the PM announced yesterday, because we have to secure our own borders and that of Europe in this new environment that we're in. The post-Berlin Wall falling dividend of peace that we had in Europe has now gone when the tanks from Putin rolled in to Ukraine. So that's what this was about yesterday. And we can argue and discuss and debate the figures, but we wanted to get to 2.5% of GDP. That was in our manifesto, and it's been hastened by the fact of the current situation in Ukraine. And the gravity of that situation is clear. It's been accepted right across the House in every single political party that that's where we had to get to, and that's what the Prime Minister has delivered yesterday. In terms of this Chagos red herring that the Conservatives seem to keep pulling out of the hat, they're having another debate on it in the House today, as if there's nothing else to debate in the House of Commons, is that the former Foreign Secretary, when he became Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, called in the negotiations that have been started by the previous Conservative government, looked at all the legal details and all the issues around Chagos, and then decided to continue in those negotiations after he had looked at them. This is a mess we're clearing up again from the previous Conservative government, and they really need to get on with backing the Prime Minister in terms of trying to get to that defence spending of 2.5% to protect our borders and that of the wider European continent.
So I disagree with your analysis on the Chagos situation. This is a deal that you, your party and your Prime Minister is doing. We've been very clear. We don't support this deal. But the Prime Minister needs to own it. It is his decision to do this deal, which both jeopardise our national security, bad for our national security, and cost the taxpayer. However, I don't disagree at all, and we've been clear. We've been clear that we support overall the increase in spending on defence, and also the analysis of the situation in the world and the increased dangers of the world we live in. So yes, we do need to increase our spending on defence and do it more quickly than, for instance, was in your own party's manifesto. That is the right thing to do. So the bigger picture. So we agreed on the bigger picture. I just don't think it's helpful. I just don't think it's helpful to not be straight about both where the money is coming from and also where the money is going to. The other thing,
we don't know how much.
The Prime Minister was perfectly clear to the public and to the House when the deal is finalised by all parties, it will come to the Parliament in full transparency, and there may even be a vote on it if the opposition decide to do so. And therefore that is transparent and that is clear. There is no point in us fighting, two bald people fighting over a comb in terms of what it's going to potentially be in there or what's not in there. The key thing is this was started under the previous government. We've had to finalise that. And the key thing here is it's in our national security interest. It is in our national security.
Can we just bring it?
National security interest to continue to have security over that base.
Okay, Ian. Can we just bring this back to the choice to cut the aid budget to pay for the defence spending increases? I mean, David Lammy, when President Trump did the same, described it as a big strategic mistake. So not only are you breaking a manifesto commitment and actually doing the reverse, cutting the aid budget, you're actually going against what your own Foreign Secretary has said to President Trump. Why is it OK for America to do it?
The Prime Minister
for the UK to do it and not America to do it?
The Prime Minister was perfectly clear on this in the House of Commons yesterday. He had to come to Parliament and with the gravity of the situation that's been presented to us, with a fully costed plan in the current economic circumstances that we're in, and present that to Parliament. That's what he did yesterday. He regrets the fact that these big decisions and difficult decisions have had to be made, particularly on overseas aid. We still back the legislation for 0.7%. It's in our manifesto and it's legislated for in Parliament. And we will get back to there when the economic situation allows us to do so.
Well, you're a long way from your manifesto commitment now, aren't you?
But the gravity of our situation in terms of the situation in Europe at the moment, it's in our national security interests and in Europe's national security interests.
Well, the gravity of the situation in Europe was clear years ago.
Well, but it has been brought into sharp focus with the invasion of Ukraine from Putin.
Well, it's been brought into sharp focus by the arrival of President Trump, hasn't it, in the White House?
Well, things have obviously crystallised on the basis of the way and the posture of the American position at this moment in time. But the bottom line here is we've always had to look towards Europe and look towards our friends across the Atlantic to secure Europe. We also know that any peace deal in Ukraine will have to be backed up by US guarantees in terms of security, otherwise Putin will ignore it. And therefore this is an organisation in terms of what we're trying to develop to make sure we have safe and secure borders in Europe, and that is in everyone's interest, including all of our NATO allies.
OK, Helen, brief.
Well, so as Ken was clear, we do support the decision to make savings from the aid budget and put it into defence. But also what I'm keen to see, we're keen to see, is we know that we need to increase defence spending further. Where's the extra money going to come from? And when is the 3% target going to be hit? One of the things that I would say to you and to take back to your colleagues is we know that there are opportunities to make savings in welfare. For me, as Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, this is clearly an area that I'm looking at and urging the government to get on with making savings in welfare. And one way that that can then go to is to support the further spending on defence.
The last time this country spent 2.5% on GDP in defence was under the last Labour government.
OK, we will have plenty more discussion about this in the coming weeks, but I do want to just go to Vicky, because Keir Starmer is now off to Washington, isn't he, after PMQs?
Yeah, that's right. He'll be heading out there, and of course lots of chat about how he's going to handle all of this. I mean, it's tempting to say that he might just want to get through it without any huge diplomatic incidents. And when we saw how Emmanuel Macron dealt with it earlier in the week, a lot of handshaking, a lot of knee touching. You know, they, of course, know each other very well because they were both in power when President Trump was in the White House last time round. Very different scenario with the Prime Minister. He has met Donald Trump privately for dinner, but, you know, they've spoken on the phone. They don't know each other that well. Now, clearly, this defence announcement might help smooth the path a little bit. You know, we heard from the American Defence Secretary that, yes, they're pleased with this, but they do want a lot more. And I thought there was a very interesting thread through Prime Minister's questions today. If you heard about the bubbling of criticism about President Trump from all sides, you know, you had Ed Davey for the Liberal Democrats talking about how you can't rely on America anymore. You had some Labour backbenchers getting up and saying, you know, what are we going to do about the way he's treating Ukraine? You had a Conservative MP talking about the way that Canada's being treated by America. You know, there's a lot of that discontent, and how much Keir Starmer voices that face-to-face with President Trump is going to be interesting. I would doubt very much. He's going to be focusing on the areas where they agree. He can now say, I have led the way here on this defence spending. I'm going to encourage my European leaders to do the same.
OK, well, someone who might know a bit about how Keir Starmer should navigate this meeting is Gordon Sondland, former US ambassador to the EU from 2018 to 2020, excuse me, under Donald Trump's first presidency. Gordon, many thanks for joining us from New York. Keir Starmer is coming armed to the White House with this defence spending promise. Is that going to be enough, do you think, to impress President Trump?
Well, I think it's going to be a start, and I think there's too much show business going on here, too much rehearsing. I think that Keir Starmer should ask President Trump for some time one-on-one, and he should remind President Trump that the UK, you know, completed Brexit largely at President Trump's urging, that, you know, the US and the UK are the closest of allies, and that the UK wants to help navigate this very, very difficult situation that President Trump found himself in after President Biden essentially encouraged Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine. And President Trump is playing the cards that he has right now. And Starmer has an opportunity to work with President Trump very closely. Yes, defense spending is going to be part of it, but also having troops on the ground, British troops on the ground to help security guarantees. But the biggest security guarantee for Ukraine would be a massive investment by the U.S., by Europe, by the UK in the country, because then everyone can turn to Putin and say, now you're not attacking Ukraine, you're attacking us, and we're not going to stand for it.
Gordon, if I heard you right, did you say that President Biden had encouraged Putin to invade Ukraine?
A small incursion, I don't know what I'm going to do. It might be okay. That's exactly what he did.
In what way did he do that?
He made a very, very fatal statement, and it was a signal to Putin that Putin could move on Ukraine with potentially U.S. apathy to follow. First was Afghanistan. That was not a good, that did not show the U.S. in the best light. But then when he told Putin publicly, I won't countenance an invasion, but if it's a small incursion, we'll see. And to Putin, that's a signal, because Putin's default setting is, I'm going to take Ukraine one way or another. That's where Putin wakes up every morning.
Right. I mean, I certainly think that Keir Starmer would disagree with that analysis of how this reinvasion of Ukraine started. Should he be honest with President Trump about his differences in opinion? I mean, President Macron tried to do some real-time fact-checking, didn't he, when he met President Trump? Let's have a quick look at what happened when they met.
Just so you understand, Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total effort, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money, to be clear. Yeah. We have 230 billion frozen assets in Europe, Russian assets, but this is not as a collateral of a loan, because this is not our belonging. So they are frozen. If at the end of the day, in the negotiation we will have with Russia, they're ready to give it to us, super. It will be loan at the end of the day, and Russia would have paid for that.
If you believe that, it's okay with me.
Well, President Macron, they're trying to interject to correct Donald Trump. How would President Trump have taken that?
How would he have taken the correction? Look, I think this is all a waste of time. I think we should take where we are at this very moment and look forward and quit trying to reconcile past facts, because they actually don't matter as much as where we go from here. We are where we are. I think what Trump is trying to do is separate Putin and Zelensky initially and work Putin very hard. And the interesting thing he's doing with Putin, it's not a question for Trump as to whether Ukraine keeps Ukraine or Putin gets to take Ukraine. There's a third alternative, which is the U.S. gets Ukraine. And when I say that, I don't mean we're going to take over the country. They're going to remain a sovereign Western democracy. But we are all of a sudden going to pour a tremendous amount of financial resources into and exploit rare earth and exploit other minerals together with Ukraine. And I think the Europeans should join us in that.
Right. Well, talking about taking over another country, President Trump has posted a pretty shocking video this morning on his Truth Social account. It was an AI-generated video appearing to visualise his plan for a takeover of Gaza, the relocation of Palestinians to neighbouring Arab countries, and the creation of a resort, a Riviera in the Middle East, according to President Trump. An AI-generated video, it seems. But President Trump has posted this on his Truth Social account this morning.
Do you really take that seriously? I mean, what President Trump is trying to do here is to say, I'm going to move forward with a plan that no one else likes. However, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, other countries, where are you? Where is your plan, and when are you going to move on it? Time is wasting.
So he's trying to bounce them into a more realistic plan.
But they haven't come up with a plan. That's the problem. And not only have they not come up with a plan, they're not executing on anything. They should be there en masse and working with Israel on this, and they're not. And he's saying, fine, if you don't want to do that, I have a great idea and I'm going to exploit it. And by the way, I'm going to do it now. I'm not going to do it a year from now or 10 years from now. I'm going to do it now. And all of a sudden now, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and other moderate Arab countries are all going, wait, we want to do something. And Trump's response is, go ahead, do it. Quit talking and start doing.
OK, Gordon, I'm going to keep you there for one moment and come back to our panel here in the studio. Ian, is Gordon right?
Well, I think the issue for the Prime Minister when he gets off the flight in Washington is to cut through all of this and really to speak to President Trump about what's in our mutual interests, and that's strengthening the relationship between both countries. It's about security and defence in Europe, and it's about trade and keeping on those things that are in the UK's national interest and trying to cut through some of the noise that's going on around it. I mean, all of those questions today, Prime Minister's questions, will he raise this, will he raise that? The Prime Minister has to go there, and he's going there with a very clear agenda about security and defence in Europe, about Ukraine, and that's what he'll stay on because it's in our UK national interest to be that bridge between the US and Europe.
Gordon, would he get those security guarantees, do you think, Keir Starmer, on Ukraine?
I think that Keir Starmer should offer first what the UK is prepared to do and ask President Trump to join them rather than demanding concessions from President Trump. I know that that might be a distinction without a difference, but I think it would tremendously impact how President Trump responds. In other words, we're prepared to put X number of boots on the ground. We're prepared to put X number of dollars in a fund to help defend Ukraine. We're prepared to send the following weapons. That's for a small country like ours. I mean, your GDP is 8 or 9 times what our GDP is, but that's a lot for us. Will you join us in that? That's how he should present this. It's very clear.
Helen?
I'm pretty much also in agreement with what Ian just said about the importance of Keir Starmer going to the US and having a conversation with the President, which is very focused on our national interests and clearly understanding the US perspective on this. As part of that, it's crucial that we continue to communicate that we stand with Ukraine. Everyone wants an end to the war, but not at any cost. I think it's very important that it doesn't turn out to be something that can be painted as a victory for Putin. That's, of course, what he's going to want. He was the aggressor in this, and if we know anything from the last 20 years, it's if he gets a chance, he will come back for more. So actually, we want an end to the war. Ukraine needs to be in the room, and it should not be a victory for Putin.
And the coming back for more is a critical part, and that's why any deal that is negotiated has to have A, Ukraine round the table, and B, be underpinned by US security guarantees. Otherwise, Putin will come back.
Gordon, can I bring you back in on that point that Helen just made? Does President Trump worry that this deal could look like a victory for President Putin?
I don't think President Trump is as worried about the cosmetics as he is about the reality. If Putin wants to call it a victory, let him call it a victory. If at the end of the day, Putin is expected to give back some of the 20% of Ukraine that he's taken, the U.S. and Europe have a tremendous investment in Ukraine and are building Ukraine up as a true Western democracy, both financially and militarily. And Putin knows that now any attack against Ukraine really is an attack against the U.S., even if the Ukraine is not part of NATO and the U.S. does not have any Article 5 obligations. Sometimes a financial interest is greater than a treaty interest. And frankly, I think Putin is going to be the loser, even if he wants to think of himself as the winner.
Ian, I mean, Keir Starmer wouldn't want this to come out as a victory for Putin, to embolden Russia to act again in the same way?
Well, the Prime Minister, the Government and the entirety of Parliament have spoken with one voice on this. We back the sovereignty of Ukraine. We want a long-term peaceful solution here in terms of the borders.
Does that worry you, then, what you've heard from Gordon?
Well, it worries me slightly in terms of what we're hearing, but the Prime Minister is going to Washington with that very clear message of what the Government and the UK's position is. And Parliament has said with one voice on this that we want a sovereign state of Ukraine. We need safety and security in Europe. It's in NATO's interests for that also to be the case, and America plays a key role in that. And that's the message that the Prime Minister, I'm sure, will be given to President Trump tomorrow.
Gordon, while we still have you in... Go on.
The problem that President Trump has with Ukraine NATO membership is very simple. If Russia attacks Ukraine and Ukraine is in NATO, regardless of why Russia attacked Ukraine, the U.S. has a solemn obligation to defend Ukraine. And the U.S. is essentially the one on the hook, no matter what. And if Ukraine is not in NATO, but has other types of security guarantees, such as European peacekeepers, such as a tremendous amount of U.S. financial interaction with Ukraine, it gives the U.S. optionality. And the U.S. needs to keep optionality. Otherwise, it's ensuring things that it can't possibly ensure in the future.
Gordon, was the US right to vote with its historic enemies at the UN the other day on votes concerning Ukraine? It sided with North Korea, with Russia. Its resolution didn't criticise Russia when it came to the war in Ukraine.
Well, it didn't side with North Korea. It voted for the same resolution as North Korea. That doesn't mean it's siding with North Korea.
In a way that it didn't before.
I think what Trump is trying to do there is he's got a strategy when it comes to Putin, and he is working that strategy. Then he's going to turn to Ukraine and then put the whole thing together. And again, I think we should stop worrying about the cosmetics of this. What's important is where we wind up in the next few weeks.
OK, Gordon, many thanks indeed. Gordon Sondland there talking to us from New York. That is all we have time for today. But I will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and on iPlayer. Many thanks to my panel, Helen Whately, Ian Murray and our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young.
Disinformation.
There is no climate change.
You think you're winning.